I'm going to head over to Kirsty Inns, Head of the Digital Government Unit at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Kirsty, over to you.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much all for being with us today. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity for what I think will be a really fascinating conversation about what I think is one of the most interesting and challenging areas for reform of public services, the move to opening up technology opening up education using technology. Over the past 15 months or so during the pandemic, one of the key concerns, maybe the second concern after keeping everyone healthy, has been to make sure we continue to have a good quality education for our children. It's fair to say that the pandemic forced a lot of parents, students, and schools into quite a brutal pivot towards remote and online technologies. For many students, they're now back in the classroom, or increasingly back in the classroom. I'm really interested to hear what lessons have been learned and what parts of their experience of remote and online learning do they want to keep. What happens next to make sure we keep the opportunity of that experience and that learning, and we integrate the best parts of that into the way we tackle education going forwards? What's been valuable and beneficial? What bits of it don't they want to repeat ever? In my organisation, we're kicking off some work to look into these questions and investigate how far we can take the potential of tech to unlock the benefits of a world-class education for everyone in the world. We published a blog on our website this morning at institute.global, which sets out how we see the challenge. I hope many of you will get a chance to read it, but there's a brief summary. It sets out how we see the scale of demand for education increasing rapidly, both as a result of population growth and also access. It's good news in many ways that increasing the proportion of the global population is now able to have the time and the resource to access education, but it means that student numbers are increasing exponentially. Spending is not keeping pace with that, and there's a question as to whether that's the right or the wrong thing, but it's not keeping pace at the moment. And at the same time, expectations of education are changing. What students want and what the role we see education having in our society is changing. Is it there to prepare people for the workforce, or is there a broader social and kind of personal function to it to help us produce citizens who are happy and fulfilled in their lives? Technology is both the driver of this change in expectations and probably part of the solution. So for one thing, we know that the workforce today's students will be entering looks absolutely nothing like the workforce of 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that a lot of the solutions lie in applying technology more broadly as well. Our thesis is that there are pockets of really good technologies that are providing vastly more stimulating and more accessible and more personalized, more smart educational experiences for students. But these are isolated and they tend to be limited to pockets of the world's most well-off students. We posit that with a much more ambitious approach to developing tech-inclusive education, you could mainstream those practices and make them available to a much wider population. I'd like to test that thesis and hear about what's been achieved over the past year in schools and what a fully tech-enabled education looks like and what are the practical steps we take to get there. And to do that, I'm going to be joined by two hugely experienced experts working at the intersection of tech and education. Firstly, we have Les Hopper, Director of Digital and Assessment at Pearson UK. Les's background is in developing and delivering digital education projects and solutions, and he worked previously at Oxford University Press, where he developed partnerships to deliver blended learning across the UK, Oceania and South Africa, and now at Pearson UK. And we have Will Zemp, Global Lead and Director for Education to Workforce at Amazon Web Services. Will oversaw the development and application of new technologies for the US Army before moving on to the EdTech sector and launching an EdTech incubator and setting up the Innovation Center at the US's largest online university, Southern New Hampshire University, before he joined AWS. So welcome to both of you. I'm really pleased to be here having a conversation with both of you about this fascinating set of questions.
Great to be here. Thanks, Kirsty.
Let me start by turning to you, Les. I'd love to know, from your perspective at Pearson, how have schools coped over the past month or so? How has Pearson's offer to teachers and students had to evolve? What are the kind of changes and trends you've seen in the way people have approached learning and managed that and really rapid shift to online? What's that been like for you and your organisation?
Yeah, so in answer to your first question, how have teachers and schools coped, and children and parents, brilliantly. So I think it's been a massive roller coaster, as we've all experienced and watched on the news. And what we've seen is that teachers have been able to pick up what have been completely new technology solutions to them, work out how they can fit in with their teaching, get them installed in the school, and reached out to students at home and been able to keep learning working. So it's been fantastic. And for our part at Pearson, we've been doing our best to keep up with that and to make sure that all our tools are available. We've made them free where possible, just as many people did, in order to bridge any gaps that might exist out there. So yeah, a hugely interesting period of time. I think what we're also seeing now is what happens next. So things have started to gradually switch back to normal. We've seen more students back in the classroom, albeit in a slightly different way. But what we haven't seen is teachers and schools decide to drop the technology they've picked up. So when we think about the point of this whole session that we're in, we're hearing back from schools that what they've seen is that technology is doing things for them that they didn't think it could do before. They're keen to hold on to some of those solutions, to use them in a different way, and to think about what that means for their teaching practice. So a really exciting time for us, and we're working in partnership with a number of schools and school chains to look at what our next suite of learning resources are like, and what features they should have, how that helps hybrid schooling, what features have been missing from this last period of hybrid schooling, and yeah, trying to imagine what the future looks like.
Sounds great. What does that look like in practice? What kinds of technologies are we talking about, and what kinds of products are students and teachers wanting to hang on to and use more of?
Yeah, so the most common ones we've seen people want to hang on to are things like simple homework setting. Let me tell you what your work is, track it, give you a place where you can ask me questions, give me a place where I can respond to you. So keeping that communication going in a way that's very difficult outside a classroom environment, sometimes even within a classroom environment, to give that kind of one-to-one support. So those types of features are definitely here to stay, I would say. Beyond that, just different ways in which people can teach. So for instance, do you want to send out a brief video of yourself where you might previously have stood at the front of the class, given some input to your class? Now you can send it in advance, ask them to watch it, take what's called a flipped classroom approach, and then use the lesson time where you've got one-to-one to try and work through any misconceptions people might have, or any problems they have, or queries. And the idea of that is that you get more one-to-one time, again, with students, more time where you as a teacher can interact with them and try and move their learning along in a way that's not just broadcast. So some of that broadcast has been shifted online. With all of this, there are opportunities and challenges. So one thing that we've really focused on is the learning from our virtual schools business globally, where they've been trying to tackle these kinds of problems over the last 10 years or so, even longer. And they've developed some distinct ideas around pedagogy. So the pedagogy for learning in a classroom, the one that all teachers are taught during their training, is a particular pedagogy that is very tried and tested. It works in a particular way. We tend to make incremental improvements to it over time. So we come in with new ideas about a mastery pedagogy, for instance, but a lot of the elements of it are the same. Students tend to be sat in a particular place. Teachers tend to be presenting from a particular place. When we talk about hybrid, we need to rethink entirely what learning looks like. We need to think about, okay, well, my student might not even be in the room with me. They very much haven't been in the last year. As a teacher, what does that mean I need to do? I can't see how they're responding to what I'm saying. I can't think on my feet and respond in the way that I normally would. So how can I set up in advance to do that? And we're taking that learning, and we're, for instance, for all of our materials moving forward, developing lessons that work in 3 modes. So you can still use them in the classroom in the way that you'd like to. You can also use them if you want to work very much like this on a kind of live remote lesson. But you could equally use them for what's called an asynchronous lesson. So where you've got students and sometimes younger pupils and their parents working all at different times, but with the same material. And you want to make sure they have a great learning experience, even though you can't be there with them. So embedding those kinds of principles is a step change, I think a really positive one. But that's the kind of stuff that we're thinking about now and that we're embedding for the future.
Super interesting. Thanks. Let me ask you, Will, now about your experience and and experiences of AWS, you're engaged in helping make sure students have the tools and resources to help them adapt and be ready for a workforce that is very cloud enabled, certainly. And I wondered, how has that evolved over the past year? What do you see as the kind of expectations and the aims that students have for their education?
Yeah, on the student side, and again, having global partners and seeing this kind of from every angle, it was very interesting. This is the first digital generation, right? And when we talk to in particular educators who had been that Les, I think, rightly characterizes around experience, there's a theme that students took part in the architecture of technology and how it was used in classrooms, and that's interesting, and we're paying attention to that and how you work back from that. But you had I was whether you call it fortunate or cursed, we are a family of educators. So my wife's in the school system, and then I have two twins that are in high school. And I watched this play out where, kind of the leaning in on the students, or the students actually stopping and correcting or taking an instructor or educator through features for which they weren't intended for the solution in the classroom. And it's kind of fun, it's kind of scary. And again, just kind of to take it back up to AWS and how we engage, we saw this, my own onboarding, for instance, was kind of a trial. How do you bring on an executive and get them, up to speed in a proper way? And the whole time you're leaning on, the kind of the older side of the millennials, but in this, Gen Z, from the recruiters aspect of what they're looking for, and how to get you onboarded into a job that you want to stay and you want to have a great experience. But where technology won the day was when, I think, because education is like healthcare, it's such an intimate space, right? It's learning such an intimate solution space. But where technology won the day is where it enhanced those human to human sides, but then totally revamped the places where, maybe the humans were having to do it, but they didn't need to. So along the lines of, again, what Les brought up, assessment or scheduling class, or, all this stuff. And I don't think that's going to go back. I think the way forward, or the next year and a half, will be characterized by iteration, right? Because we're already seeing where people will go too far with the application of technology for cost-saving measures, right? But changing over to hybrid or use of emerging technologies in a crisis is very different than deliberate pedagogy application for a hybrid school, right? So, the approach of a hybrid school system and application of technology is we're seeing a lot of success around that, and a lot of success around student outcomes. Where you're trying to just make the classroom hybrid, that's not working. The jury's out. We've got 2 semesters, almost 3 semesters worth of data, not counting the crisis period of kind of the migration of everybody kind of flocking to it. So what are you going to do now that you have data around learning outcomes, and then the application of these technologies and how they were used or not used correctly in the classroom?
Fascinating. Loads I want to unpack there, but yeah, can you tell us a bit more about your sort of insights into how students and teachers might have used, say, video platforms like Chime? Yeah. So everybody went to Google. Everybody went to Zoom. Everybody kind of went to their thing. Free one today, right? You're going to have users for life. But then once you got on there, the application of policy, for instance. So you still had the archaic policy of a student had to be in a seat a certain amount of time. And so you literally have this behavioral pattern, and this is global, of kid rolls out of bed, goes straight to the computer and sits there, and sits there for 8 hours. Well, it's kind of crazy with 5 minutes in between.
So you have to, the wear and tear on a learner and then an educator. And then what you begin to see is this kind of negotiation between the learner who's very, very tech savvy and the professor who's just, trying to kind of keep it all together. So you saw things like open days, like Wednesdays or Thursdays, where, it was kind of, we're going to just talk to each other over text, right? Which, you have to address certain policies so we can all get a break from each other. But yet the engagement scores went up because people thought that they were being engaged, more one-on-one when they weren't. But you got to unpack that. And then around learning outcomes, because once states and governments began to sort it out, you began to see what didn't work. So they over-indexed on application technology. So you have half the class in, half the class out, and then your mental stress on educators went through the roof because that's almost incompatible. Or you had people in classrooms that had their own cubicles and they were facing away from the instructor, and half the classroom was at home. And so, so do you want to keep that? Because in those situations, learning outcomes, you should either brought everybody in or brought everybody out. But the redefinition of a snow day, the redefinition of a sick day, what does a weekend mean? Especially when you can bring on assessments through AI entities or machine learning that can really help do the non-human, non-intimate things. But again, that's why I kind of go back to the way forward is going to be iteration and catch up, right? You got labor policy that has to catch up with this. You've got, the whole archaic, we're going to measure student outcomes by time they have in a seat. That's got to be over. I mean, so it's kind of the age of Gen Z and the personalization that they demand, and then competency-based, learning outcomes, which that's what employers are looking for. So, I mean, a lot of opportunity here. If you don't think what happened over the year and a half is the way forward, right? You kind of got to see it was a catalyst. It got us here. We're seeing more and more the comparative value is like that of an area that went through a crisis or almost wartime or a hurricane, not, hey, we all got together to think about what's best for the student and then we're moving there. Like that's the places that are doing that are we're just not seeing learning outcomes matching. So I'll stop there and see if there's any more.
Super fascinating. And that's so, it really resonated with me what you said about engagement going up on the days when there was actually less face-to-face teaching time, because of course there will be different personal preferences as to how to interact and different generational preferences that the surveys we've gotten back are the learner is like, why do you guys keep calling it online? Right? This is how we learn. This is how we communicate. It's the rise of Gen Z, and it's the recognition of the introvert, right? I mean, and all your engagement scores are passing that. And the educators that are picking up on that, and companies like Pearson that are keen in to be a tool to make that happen, will be well positioned because kind of go back to my time at SNU. I mean, people would arrive. We did have a campus and we were online, but the student they were demanding personalization. They were demanding, and those behaviors replicated when electricity and light came into schools. Like people, there was this kind of period where you still had lamp and you had electricity, and then students started picking schools that had electricity because it was now a utility. It wasn't it wasn't. And we're finding the same thing. So now what happens after you've had this catalyst? And they feel as if they have more control over their education. The customer, the learner, won't go back. Yeah. And the person that's receiving them on the other end as an employer, they don't want them to go back because those are the skills that they need, and they're currently paying between $5,000 to $10,000 to upscale their learners. So there's a lot of catch up, a lot of iteration. Right? This isn't over. It's not bad, but it's just we got to work through it. Totally. You've both mentioned assessment at certain points, and that's something that certainly has been very controversial here in the UK. The government's attempts to put in place assessments to replace in-person exams last year and this year have attracted a lot of attention. And I wondered where you both think we're up to with that. Are we in a world where we now have satisfactory alternatives to in-person, paper-based exams, or will there always be a role for in-person assessment? Is there just no way to kind of move on from that completely? Les, let me ask you first, then I'll come to Will.
Yeah, of course. So I suppose I should preface this by saying this is my personal view. Obviously Pearson has a stake in offering high stakes assessment in the UK, and I'm sure there are people there who could give a more considered view. But my personal view is yes, and some of the questions we're asking ourselves are, what does assessment look like from now on? Will's done a really good job of outlining, Gen Z and the changes that they expect to see in the workplace. But that translates back into changes in education as well. And those are the same kind of changes that teachers are pushing for. They're saying, well, is it really reflective of my student's ability at the age of 17, 18 to sit down and handwrite an essay for 3 or 4 hours, where actually all the work they've done before and most of the work they'll do afterwards will be based on a keyboard. So why would we sit down and write it out in analog fashion? Also, we can ask ourselves some kind of more advanced questions. Again, Will mentioned personalization, really hot topic, something that we're thinking about a lot. Is it possible for technology to provide a personalized assessment experience? Absolutely, it is. And that could be part of future qualifications. At the same time, and on the other side of this equation, we've seen the controversy around assessment over the last couple of years and how dependable, reliable, fair those systems are. Any steps that we take in that direction need to be weighed against that. Can we make sure that this year's kids are not being disadvantaged in some way, that there's no bias crept into the system in a way that could have been foreseen? Any technology we apply, can we make sure that's not applying any conscious or unconscious bias? There's lots of challenges there, but I think now does seem to be the time where people are more open to it, where previously those conversations have been quite closed and everyone's accepted the pen, the paper, the little desks that we're all used to from our time back in school, which for me was a little while back now.
And what was your take, Will?
Yeah, I love that Les brought in fair, right? Because assessment is it's a gateway and it's a milestone for access. I kind of an evidence-based approach that we're looking at. A lot of controversy was assessment that had AI but not machine learning in it. So now you've got another emerging technology that's coming on board. Healthcare is a little bit ahead of us. I think it's going to go the way of that, especially when you look at kind of how humans react. There's nothing that's going to take the place of a doctor sitting down with someone and talking through a cancer diagnosis, right? Humans don't want that from computers right now, and they don't want that from robots. And we see learners are the same way. 5-year-olds don't like robots in the classroom. It's kind of cute and funny, but they don't want to be talked to by it, right? They want that interaction. There's something to be taken from that. So in healthcare right now, with machine learning and AI, you can pick up at about a 99% rate of identifying certain cancers. The best human being can only do it at a 79 to 80 on a good day, consistently. So with that, if myself, I want to be assessed by the computer, but I want to work with my doctor on what we do and how we learn and how we move through, that process. We are seeing kind of the same thing. So, our educators and learners they're in a time, what they're calling with the time poverty, right? There's just not enough time and assessment around the time around assessment could be better spent engaging students. And why iterate? Like, why just do it at the end of the week or take a test? We have the technologies in place now, through all kind of tools of you can do it just in time. So students getting constant feedback. And you can gear towards mastery as opposed to a B, C, D, right? So you're constantly in this feedback. What I would say though is your best assessments are going to be built and trained by our best educators, not a rubric, right? So it's this kind of, again, the theme is this interaction of best practices on the human side with the untapped potential of these these technologies, and then bringing them together so it's a more coherent tech human solution. Does that make sense? So, I mean, assessment, I think we're there. You know, you don't want to give that up, but the educators that understand it and then understand what it can do for them and their relationships with students will be the champions of it. From where I represent, whenever you look to replace that, like replace an educator, it doesn't make sense. The evidence doesn't support it. The tech doesn't support it. Right now, will we get there? Yeah, sure, in some places, but it's going to be, you know, how do you enhance the best qualities of an educator and then proliferate it through technology? That's where the students are going to benefit.
Yeah, makes complete sense. And sort of building on that, as you mentioned earlier, the kind of pedagogy that most teachers sort of working today would having been trained in as something that was, you know, not at all envisaging online and remote teaching and learning methods. So in a sense, the whole practice of teaching has got to evolve. What do you think, you know, the pace of change in technology is so rapid. How should we be training teachers now so that they are able to teach in a way that can bring in new technologies as they emerge and become available? How does the practice of teaching need to change to sort of embrace that?
Yeah, so a nice small question for this point in the talk, but I think the simple answer is it's down to people, right? So despite all the technology that we're bringing to play, we're talking about a couple of different scenarios. You're either at the front of a room physically with some students, or you're in front of a group of students on a screen, or those students are taking their learning at their own pace. Those are the three scenarios we've got at the moment, and maybe there are a couple more. But if we were to have a situation where teachers were trained with those scenarios in mind, then even though the technology we're bringing to bear on those scenarios will change, the fundamentals of them won't. And if teachers are trained in a way, as they've been trained themselves, you know, through this whole period, to say, okay, well, what's changed? You know, what's the fundamental dynamic I've got, and how do I get the best learning out of it? And what have I got available in my toolkit to work on this? Then we'll be in a really good place. So then, you know, whatever Will comes up with, which I'm sure will be fantastic out of AWS, whatever we can come up with to support that, they'll have a whole range of things to choose from. And then their expertise as a teacher, as a professional, as someone absolutely at the heart of our education system becomes the most important thing. All we do is give them more knowledge and more tools. And I think that's really the kind of system we want to have. If we fall back on going into teacher training that says, okay, well, based on the last year, we need to make sure that you know how to use an online assignment system, and you know how to use a video call system, then that's going to be out of date pretty soon, right? And there'll be another set of tools. So focus back on people, and I don't think we can go too far wrong. If I can, I just wanted to mention a couple of things back on Will's points as well. So I was really glad Will brought in the whole idea of formative and ongoing assessment there, and you know, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things we haven't spoken about so much is that ability for technology to build a picture of a student and their learning as you go along, and to make that picture available to the student, available to the teacher, to analyze what that means across a cohort, and to use that to target where people could benefit from a learning intervention, no matter what it is. And for that to potentially build up into this sort of longer term picture. And linking back to your question for this section, if that kind of tool becomes part of the toolkit for teachers, no matter where learning is taking place, then again, it's an incredibly powerful application of technology, because it's recognizing that, you know, you're the expert here, but let's give you as much information in the best form possible for you to make those judgments about where learning goes next. So I think that's exciting.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm sure Will does too.
Yes. Now, Kirsty, you want me to take a kind of just the end swap at that, or?
Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I just need to echo, it's about people, and bring in healthcare for a second. You know, only 6 years ago, you go into an operating room, everyone in there has credentials around medicine and doctors or nurses. 14 people is kind of standard for a big surgery. If you go in there today, because we're paying real close attention to work, the workplace that we're preparing people for. If you go in there today, there's probably only 4. The doctor could or could not be in the room because they're halfway across the country using some kind of robot or kind of some kind of simulation. But the other people in the room are tech. There's somebody that's working on the Wi-Fi. There's somebody to ensure that any kind of augmented reality tool that's being used by the doctors is up and running. And so, I mean, that's changing. So, we're only a little bit behind it in the education space. So I think, will the classroom and the teacher change? No, I think, but the team around them, I think should, right? Because what do? We get a platform, we get some functionality. Each one of those functionalities should be looked at as a language. So you're asking some poor teacher that's got, the classroom's overfull anyway, and they've got a big schedule, but now you're asking them to learn 5, 6, 7 different languages because it's a great thing, some add-on to some LMS somewhere. The other thing is there's a heap of technology in the corner because somebody thought it was a good idea, but you didn't get the right enablement or training, and the students, it's already, the students don't want to use it because it's already outdated or something like that. We're heaping that all on the teacher, but what does a department look like in 5 years? Is it okay to have an AV person that has some kind of teaching credential, or a tech person that has some kind of teaching credential that's in and out of those spaces? That's really exciting, right? Because you're seeing, if there's an emphasis on the relationship between the student and the educator, and that's where tech's going to come in, then that's where your additional skills are going to come in as well. And once educators see it, I'm going to be a champion here, but it's not so much resistance. They have seen where kind of EdTech has come in and not been very helpful and kind of taken away from student outcomes and this, that, and the other. But they're willing to try it, and when they see it help students, I mean, then all of a sudden you get this big adoption across the board. But again, I think pay attention to healthcare. Pay attention to healthcare, both from a skill set and assessment set, and just how human beings kind of respond to it. Because young people aren't showing up. And I say young people, it's also, because you got to remember Gen Z is now entering the workforce as well. They're not showing up and having these crazy discussions over the benefits of technology. They're showing up and saying, why don't you use this technology to do what, they're looking at us like we're archaic. And they're like, no. So this, getting their voice into it, I think is going to be important, because that's who the educators listen to more than anybody else right now.
Yeah. That feels completely intuitively right to me, and I really like what you said about kind of recognizing the diverse team that needs to surround sort of teachers in order to make the whole operation work. And it feels to me like that's something that's been coming for a long time. This recognition that teaching isn't just one skill or one thing.
Right.
We expect teachers to generate content and deliver content and offer coaching and offer behavioral management and offer extracurricular activities and.
Right, yeah. But look where that generation in particular is taking their parents and grandparents to learn, and look where educators are directing them to learn. So Twitch, platform, kind of Truth in Lending, we've acquired it, but it's still one of the biggest proliferators of learning about art, learning about food. It's a gaming system where kind of gaming community gets on, you learn cheat codes and techniques, but it's now become like this huge proliferation of learning. And then, but there's self-organizing communities. And what we're finding now is that there's so much tutoring going on, because group of kids meets, a gamer that's at Caltech, working on math, and then they get together and, we've kind of seen this kind of flush out. But hey, if you want these cheat codes, do these 4 problems, right? And so they're supposed to be learning about Call of Duty or some video game, but yet but then their grades are going up. And so, do we want to overanalyze that, or do you just kind of accept that that's what's happening? And then what you don't want to do is come in and just kind of put so much performance pressure on it that you kind of snuff out that community. So yeah, again, a lot of opportunity out there, but a lot of opportunity to get it wrong as well.
Absolutely. I wanted to take a couple of questions from the audience while we've still got 5 minutes or so. Can I start with a question around the gaps between different countries and geographies? So the audience member asks, both of you, what are the solutions for addressing the gaps across countries to fix inadequacies or gaps in pupil achievement? So yeah, I guess it's really addressing this grand strategic question I mentioned at the beginning. How do we open up the huge possibilities that we see here to a much more wider global student population? Les, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll give the quick version. So I think technology is great. It means that a teacher in one part of the world can reach students, pupils in any other part of the world. That's a fantastic step. With that in mind alone, device access is a decreasing challenge. More and more people have access to devices, but what those devices can do, how easy it is to charge them, how much internet bandwidth they get, remains a challenge. So if I had to pick one thing, I'd say, get great electricity and broadband in as many places as possible. It opens up possibilities.
Great. What about you, Will?
I just want to echo that. I mean, mobile first. If you want to make an impact globally, go mobile first, and then kind of a Pelotonish approach to proliferation and amplification of your best educators, both through simulation and then through video.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Time for one more, I think. Do you believe that the future of assessment will happen through collection of student data during the learning experience, hence replacing decoupled teach and assessment process? I mean, it kind of picks up on the conversation we were having a couple of minutes ago, but I guess it's putting you on the spot to say, will we move to an almost completely sort of real time or continuous assessment model?
So if I answer that, I'm going to sit on the fence a little bit and say I'd like to see what that means first. So I want to make sure that when we're seeing the kind of data you might get off a kid rushing through a couple of homeworks a week, does that help them enough to be an important piece of gateway data, or are we better off sitting with the system we've got? I suspect the answer is that actually, if people understood that's what that data was doing, that it would take a different prominence in their learning experience. But the only way to do that is to try it. I'm open to trying that kind of thing. Let's get some data in, see what that looks like, see what kind of profiles of kids you get, how well it disseminates between high achievers and other middling achievers. So yeah, the only way is to experiment.
Absolutely. Yep, that makes sense to me. I wondered whether that sort of speaks to the difficulty that you see across reform of public services, in that it can sometimes be tough to experiment because it's such high stakes. It's kind of a high risk kind of sector, so there's a bit of reluctance. And sort of with that in mind, there's another question that I wanted to put to you from the audience, which is, who do you see as being the kind of gatekeepers for rolling out more adoption of new technologies in education? Is it unions? Is it teachers? Is it policymakers in central government? And the audience member asks about the UK, but I'd love to hear your perspective from the US as well as any other geographies that you want to comment on. Will, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, you got to go back to policymakers, because it's so, that's where your fiduciary responsibility is going to be. That's where your finance purse strings are. But again, you can over tech the solution, like a very expensive solution. But having a policy of a holistic combination of solutions between human skills around education and then application of those technologies, I think is going to be important. But I get cautious when I don't have a policymaker at the table that isn't like from a department or Ministry of Education. I get a lot really hopeful when you've got somebody from labor there, you've got somebody from the key executive branches decision making. That's when you're like, okay, they're very serious, because you're going to get a holistic approach, right? You get a training plan, you get technology and that kind of stuff. But yeah. I think there's a lot of gatekeepers along the way, but definitely the policymakers have to be in the accountability chain.
Absolutely. So it sounds like a real sort of cross sector, cross government, cross sort of social conversation, really bringing in the policymakers alongside the teaching profession to kind of drive forward change. I think we're about to be out of time, but thank you very much both for a really interesting conversation. Loads that I would love to pursue further with you, and I'm sure members of the audience would. So thank you both very much indeed.